Hello, I'm Pastor Paul. Welcome to the Lord of Life Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. We're glad you're here. We know that you can't always be in worship with us, so we're glad to provide the sermons from our weekly services. We hope that you will find hope and inspiration as we have in Jesus Christ. And now, here's this week's message.
So have you ever seen Kudzu running wild? Yeah. Oh, raise your hand if you've seen this. Okay. All right. So yeah. Yeah. A little background on this vine. It originally came from Eastern Asia. Introduced in the United States, thought to have been in the late 1800s at a Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Heralded at the time as a way for farmers to stop soil erosion because it would transfer, it had deep roots and helps transfer nutrients to the surface. But as Americans embraced this and spread it all over, and liberally, it ran rampant. Some experts estimate it spreads as quickly at a rate between 2,500 to 150,000 acres per year. What happened? Well, Georgia happened. And Tennessee and western North and South Carolina, if you've ever driven through there, where there's greenery everywhere, overtaking even interstates, in some cases even houses, under the weight and the shade of kudzu. Because it overpowered virtually everything around there and is a very fiercely quick-growing plant. Unchecked, it can cause some damage, at least to other things. So this raises the question, or it's a part of our conversation, because Jesus in our reading today speaks of growing from the vine. And I think a question for us to ponder is, what kind of vine growth are we? That is, if we grow, do we reflect the source that we are connected to? Do we reflect the love of God, our relationship with Christ, and the presence of the Spirit? Or do we simply spread and take over everything else, regardless of the influence? Our readings for today. In our reading, in John's Gospel, Jesus gives the final I am statement, one of several, 7 or by some counts 8 in John's Gospel. Here he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me as I abide in you. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Elsewhere in John's Gospel, just like in 1 John, we get some specifics on what this looks like, what fruitfulness looks like. It's love. God is love, 1 John writes. And those who abide in love, same language, abide in God, and God abides in them. We love because God first loved us. Now, this love and this abiding relationship is not something we muster up. We make happen by sheer grit and force and pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's something we receive. God first loved us, so it's something we simply embrace and reflect. We receive and share. Simple as that. And in doing so, we make not only God's love, but Christ known to those around us. As 1 John writes, no one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, God lives among us. And God's love has been made complete or perfect among us. So, questions I think that are raised by this is, to use this analogy of being connected, what does it mean for us to be disconnected from the vine? What does that look like? Sometimes I think we simply forget what our true source of life is. We get caught up in our successes, our ideas, our plans, our own quests for comfortable living as the goal of life. We derive our sense of identity and self-worth from what we do, and maybe lend ourselves to becoming workaholics. We value ourselves by what we own and what we accumulate. And so we work hard to accumulate as much as possible. It's the American life, after all, isn't it? Or we focus entirely on what others say about us as the be-all and end-all of what our true value is. And somewhere in that process, we become more like Kudzu, spreading for the sake of spreading, taking over without any concern for what is around, and not necessarily benefiting the ecosystem around us. We are not in harmony with our true source of life. It's not that we're totally cut off from our source of life. That's not the question. This metaphor Jesus gives us isn't about whether we are loved. It's also not a matter of whether we are saved or embraced by grace. It is a question of whether we live truly from a place of being connected to our true life source. As I think about the language of abiding, really it's relationship language, right? And relationships are something I think we can relate to and think about. Christ calls us here simply to be in relationship with Christ, listening to the Spirit's voice, knowing we're loved by God. And like any relationship, relationships take in regular investment, nurture, care, time, presence. And in the neglect of those things, relationships wither. You and I can point to relationships in our lives, significant ones, minor ones, that have withered due to lack of investment and time and energy and space. And others that have flourished and grown in fruitful and beautiful ways because of the investments we have put into it. The question here isn't whether we are saved by grace or loved. The question is whether we are aware that we are saved by grace and loved, and whether we embrace it so that it affects our daily living. I want to invite us to ponder a question, and in fact, to ponder it out loud with a neighbor next to you, however briefly. The question is, what or where and how is your connection to Christ nurtured? Where or how, tangible ways, is the connection that you have with Christ nurtured? 2 minutes. Someone near you. Go. Okay. What was named or shared? Where or how is your connection with Christ nurtured? Something was named in your conversation?
Well, I was talking to Serenity here, and I was saying that this morning she gave me a big hug, and she asked to sit with me, and I felt that that was a welcoming thing. So I was connected to God in the way that she welcomed me to church and welcomed me to have a relationship with her.
She's connected to God by being welcomed to church and also connection here at worship. Yeah. Good. Someone else? In the back.
In our communities that overlap, whether it's our neighborhood or our congregation or our work life.
In our community. Whether a congregation or a neighborhood or work life. Communities. Those foster our connection to Christ. Yeah. Someone else? Community fosters my connection. I know, but one more. Devotional time. Yeah. Related to that, something that fosters my connection is to take time deliberately for silence, to pray. We live in a noisy world, so just to remember and reflect. Yeah. The metaphor Jesus uses about connection is kind of a funny one. The vine of a grape. It's not the prettiest looking. It's pretty gangly, tangly, and it weaves and goes in all kinds of different directions. But especially to people of his day and age, this is a very meaningful metaphor. It meant life. It meant growth. It meant fruitfulness in ways that people depended on. And to build on that same thing, this metaphor I threw out with this lamp, however marvelous or not so marvelous you may think, it's not all that pretty in terms of the extension cord. A whole lot of extension cords going around. But at the end of the day, it works. And there's power, and there's light shining that comes through. So I think the power and the beauty of this is that the metaphor of being connected is, it's not a matter of us working hard or earning something or mustering up something or doing something. It's a matter of simply reaching out or embracing and opening wide. To embrace a love and power and presence that is already there. It's a little bit like simply stepping outside into the sun and receiving it. You don't have to do a lot to get a little vitamin D. You just have to step outside and be there. But if you're going to be out there a long time, put some sunscreen on. And in terms of what actually happens as we embrace this love of Christ and power in our life, I think, to conclude, the story of Acts 8 shows us a lot. What happens to Philip when he is in tune with God's Spirit at work in his life and the Spirit's lead? He's brought to new places, led on new adventures, brought into conversation and relationship with people he had never met before, and given opportunities to share the good news of Jesus with those around him. Frankly, if you study the story and read it closely, Philip doesn't do much at all, even though he is probably the main human actor. He just responds. He listens. He acts and does when prompted what he is called to do. That's it. Not a whole lot more. Philip ain't all that altogether. Neither you or I. But when we are in tune with the voice of God's Spirit at work in our life, in tune with the love that God has for you and me, and in tune with the connection we have to Christ, God can do some mighty things through ordinary people. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Thanks for listening to the Lord of Life Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. If you're ever in the Dubuque-land area, please join us for worship. Visit our website at www.lordoflife.online to learn more about service times and about our vision for serving God and our community. God bless you.